Good afternoon, you wee bastards, and welcome back to War Thunder with Koala. In today's video, we're talking helicopters, because I realised that despite being excited about the release of this new type of vehicle to War Thunder, and covering them extensively on the 1.81 dev server, I haven't actually made a video specifically discussing the Chilla Choppers since then. Not on the live server at least. So in this video, I just want to present some of my thoughts on and experiences with War Thunder helicopters, their functionality in game, what they've done to top tier, the issues with them, their strengths, their weaknesses, and whether or not they're quote unquote overpowered. This is a question that really seems to polarize the community, with some players yelling that their helis are useless, while others are disgusted by how apparently game-breaking they are. I just want to reiterate, these are all my opinions and my experiences, so please don't take my word as fact. Don't just blindly follow what I say. I don't want that. Go formulate your own opinions based on your own experiences and the experience of others you trust, and let me know what they are in the comments. The gameplay you're seeing in the background is going to be some footage I collected while using the new BO-105 CB2, the premium German helicopter. Yes, I know the thumbnail is of a hind. Thank you to Hotshot22 for that thumbnail, by the way. But the CB2 is without a doubt my favourite of the helicopters that I have so far, even despite its lack of offensive armament, which I really don't use much on the Cobras or Hinds anyway. For this video, we're going to forget the fact that Germany doesn't as of yet have a 10.0, even though they could with the Eurocopter Tiger. We're going to forget about the AH-1Z Viper firing TOW 2s rather than Hellfires, even though that shouldn't even be possible from a realistic standpoint. And we're going to forget the nations that don't have their own helicopters, even though I am begging for British helicopters, and Japan, France, and soon Italy also deserve their own. Britain first though, Gaijin. You hear me? Not biased at all. Anyway, on with the video. Firstly, I want to go over the thoughts and opinions I've seen from players regarding helicopters and their effects on the game, as well as reasoning out my own opinions and experiences before we'll talk about how some of the issues surrounding this vehicle type might be fixed. So from what I've seen, the general consensus from tankers is that helicopters are an issue for gameplay, because they can sit many miles away, wank, nearly invincible, and pop tanks with long-range ATGMs. They can outrange the radar guidance systems of top-tier SPAA, and with the spawn point cost of planes being raised in recent patches, they can be quite tough to counter. It feels unjust to be killed by a helicopter, because no matter how skilled you might be, there's very little that you can do to prevent it, especially on the large open maps with little solid cover, seen frequently at high tier. Oftentimes you'll find yourself under assault from an enemy that you cannot fight, no matter how skilled you are at the game, which leads to a lot of people thinking that helicopters are somewhat skillless. The thing is, the same applies to helicopters when the airplanes start coming in. Now, don't get me wrong, there are certain things a helicopter pilot can do against aircraft in much the same way that there are certain things tankers can do against helicopters, even on open maps. But in the majority of circumstances, an inbound plane is an automatic death sentence for a helicopter pilot. Take this match for example. Now, the second I spawned in my BO-105, I dip immediately away from my helicopter spawn point, as the first place planes are going to be looking for easy kills is right where the helicopters are spawning in, due to the fact that many helicopter pilots simply spawn in, press H, and try to lob as many ATGMs as they can at tanks on the ground before they inevitably die. I'm also flying low, skimming the ground as much as possible to try to remain unseen. So I'm literally employing 100% of the tactics at my disposal to deter aircraft from killing me. But does that matter? Nope. Instant death. What a waste of spawn points. Actually, while we're on the topic of spawn points, thank God Gaijin reduced the spawn cost of ground vehicles recently, or helicopters would ruin the game completely. Now, if you are killed instantly, you can still return in another ground vehicle, provided you have one, which every nation should. As it stands, I'd like to see a return of the spawn mechanics from last year's April Fools event, where ground vehicles could spawn infinitely regardless of how many deaths a player had, and only helicopters cost spawn points. All ground vehicles were free. Of course, in this game, airplanes would also have to cost SP. This spawn system would come into place later in the video, so just you wait. The funny thing is, the general consensus from helicopter pilots is that the usability of helicopters is disappointing because the second you bring them near the map, you're a goner. Not just from radar SPAA, but tanks as well, in particular the Russians with their insanely high velocity shells. This means that helicopters have to sit back sniping with their ATGMs, and that's just not much fun, plain and simple. Sit still, locate targets, launch, wait 15 seconds, hit, rinse and repeat. Heli pilots do actually want to be able to enter the map, perform strike runs with rockets, capture zones, or use those grenades on the AH-1G without resigning to sacrificing their helicopter the second somebody notices them. I have only seen helicopters even attempt to capture a zone 5 times since the release in 1.81, and in none of those attempts have any of them actually successfully capped. This was my closest to success, and I came surprisingly close before the Sheridan took me out from his spawn, and yes, I'm counting this as one of the 5. This was the closest I've ever seen to a helicopter capturing a zone. It's just not lucrative to attempt zone caps with helicopters. In fact, the only thing that is lucrative is to sit back miles away and snipe with ATGMs until a plane comes to kill you. Nothing else will reliably net you kills, unless the enemy team only has 1 or 2 players left, which with the new spawn system doesn't tend to happen all that often. Even when it does, you can only reliably cap on big maps like Fulda, and you have to know that the remaining enemies are nowhere near you in order to pull it off. AKA, if you know where they are, why aren't you attacking them? Plus, if the single remaining enemy is at the A side of Fulda, say, and you want to try and cap C, well, if he's the only enemy left, C is probably already captured by your team. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, in the extremely rare circumstances that you can capture a zone or approach the map at all, you're probably not actually helping your team in a noticeable way or getting into any kind of skill-based engagement. Your mandate is to never get into any sort of engagement at all, because the second you do, no amount of skill will save you. You basically just have to perform spastic maneuvers and hope the enemies miss you. The thing is, helicopter players have to think about the whole map, the team composition, and the progression of the match as a whole. If your objective is to spawn in a helicopter, you're playing that helicopter from the get-go. You have to think about what's going on, what will lead you to that vehicle, and how you will use it within the way the match is functioning. Part of your duty as a player in that role is to monitor and control your enemy team's ability to manufacture spawn points. It's very similar to what I said about the Challenger and the defensive playstyle of that tank in my Challenger video, where your role is more in the scale of macro strategy than small scale tactics. And then there's those times where the enemy team just gets steamrolled, and they can't even spawn a plane to come deal with you. They have no hope of manufacturing enough spawn points for a plane, they can barely manage to keep throwing tanks at your team, and it's probably only a matter of 2 minutes or less before they lose the game anyway. This is when helicopters can stomp, and they stomp the enemy into the ground. Unless a single stray machine gun bullet hits you anywhere and your engine immediately dies, because reasons. Let's say you're sitting 4 kilometers away from the map. The enemy team is running dry on spawn points. They're down to backup vehicles, XYZ-70s and the like in 10.0, as well as SPAA that can't hit you because you're too far away. In this case, your team is likely spawn camping already, killing enemies off the second they're off spawn protection or very near to it. And you may struggle to actually get kills at this time because your missiles simply take too long to reach their target. Even if your teammates aren't executing the enemy team as soon as they come out of spawn, and you can have the time to get your missiles onto their targets, you're still only gonna get, what, 5 kills in the best of circumstances? Compare this to a main battle tank of the same tier, like say the Leopard 2, which can easily rack up 8 kills in the same amount of time, all the while being much more capable of fighting back against enemies coming to kill him. Of course, there's always those weird instances where your team is very much losing and the enemy has all the spawn points they could need, but none of them seem to want to spawn a plane to take you out. Sometimes helis can engage each other over the map, hoping to God that there are no SPAA beneath them, but this is just a 50-50 chance of success at most, and anybody could spawn an SPAA at any moment and kill you before you have the chance to react. You're basically resigning yourself to throwing away your vehicle for a shot at a kill, and if you happen to survive, it's more luck than anything else. So in essence, when your vehicle is performing, it's arguably OP, though only because you pretty much need a plane in order to take it out. But at any other time, not only is it not overpowered, it's barely even functional, and certainly not effective. Stock helicopters are basically a waste of lions and spawn points to bring out, besides the German ones, as rockets and guns are practically useless within our diameter. You have to get so close to the enemy just to score hits reliably, let alone get a shot at a kill, that you'll be taken out in seconds, while your only tactic is spam rockets at anything that moves. Urban maps like Advance to the Rhine are your worst nightmare, as even in perfect conditions, sitting a safe distance away makes it extremely difficult to get kills, as targets will be moving in and out of solid cover, and your missiles take so long to reach their target, and Abrams, Leopard or T-80 could have driven half a kilometer by the time they do. That's the entire way across the map, ducking in and out of cover as they do. On the other hand, approaching the battlefield on urban maps can be a little bit more reliable, as few enemies will have the elevation to shoot over the tops of buildings at you from close range. But you're just hoping to God that the enemy team doesn't have any SPAA, as even non-radar AA like the ZSU-57 or Falcon will shred you in seconds. An attack helicopter's main tactic within the kind of battles that we see represented in War Thunder I'm of course turning a blind eye to the lack of infantry, would be flying in low, using terrain for cover, nap of the earth to your targets, and poking up to launch before descending back into cover, such as a hill or a rocky outcrop. The thing is, most of our maps in game just don't allow for this. And not only that, for some ungodly reason, Radar SPAA can still track you nap of the earth, meaning that they can easily follow your movements and prepare for you to show yourself, essentially pinning you into cover, where you can't really accomplish anything. This is just down to a simple fault with the way the game renders the radar function, and I imagine Gaijin is already working on fixing this. Hopefully it will be done this upcoming patch. Radar AA should need visual contact in order to lock a target. Even a thick covering of trees is enough to screw off their tracking IRL. Buildings and terrain should definitely break the lock, and I've mentioned this before, but in my opinion, the radar ability should take time to come into effect. People have long since screamed at the OP-ness of radar tracking for top tier AA, particularly our good old ego boy, the Orange Doom. By the way, mate, please come back, we need you. I believe that having a lead indicator start out as a much wider circle and narrowing in over the course of maybe 8 to 12 seconds would be much more balanced than what we have right now, allowing for aircraft to commit to a strike run, come in hard and fast, and egress out of the AO before being accurately tracked. It would also be nice if our jets in particular got some sort of warning text when they were being tracked, and helicopters should definitely have this warning system in my opinion. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments. Now, helicopters are by no means bad or useless. Please don't think that I'm saying that. They can be highly lucrative given the right circumstances, can make for a lot of fun sometimes, and are definitely capable of dealing the damage to an enemy team. In my opinion, they're far from overpowered. Actually, they're missing a lot of functionality, partly down to map design, which, as I said a few minutes ago, we will come back to, and partly due to those issues like Radar AA and airplanes. But at the same time, they're definitely not useless. I know some of you will say that helicopters were a disappointment. They're not. The ability to kill an enemy that cannot even see or hear you, let alone fire back at you from as far as 6 kilometers away, in my own personal experience, is an incredibly powerful asset, and as I said in the beginning, it does royally suck to get killed by them. You feel like you've been duped, as you were driving along, hitting all the right places, racking up kills by outplaying the enemy, by utilizing skill and tactics, what this game is about, and then boom! ATGM out of nowhere! Back to hangar, comrade! Pay up that repair bill. I've heard some feedback that the optics of the helicopters should just be nerfed, that their camera zoom from the gunner's view should just be reduced to balance them. But this would effectively nullify the one thing that helicopters can reliably do right now, snipe long range. I mean, sure, you could still do it, but it's not going to be half as reliable or easy, and it's not exactly easy already, what with everything you have to think about. In any other circumstances, helicopters at the moment are still tough to use effectively. Already, you have to spend a lot of your time moving around if you want to stay alive long enough to use the 16 missiles on the Mi-35 or Viper, constantly surprising the enemy by changing locations, orbiting the map in order to stay out of range while you do so, and that takes time. This is one of the most fun ways you can use helicopters, flying nap of the earth on Middle East, or surprisingly enough, small tier 1 Sinai, which is a horrible map for top tier tanks, don't get me wrong, but great for helicopter gameplay, as you can see here with me just lathering up kills on these poor unsuspecting bastards. The thing is, these games just aren't long enough to allow for this every match, even on the biggest maps. Actually, bigger maps don't necessarily extend playtime, because you still have that issue we've had ever since patch 1.71. You either steamroll or you get steamrolled, there's no in the middle. This is something I know Fly said about cruiser gameplay in naval forces. The matches just don't last long enough for it, and that's only going to get worse if and when we get heavy cruisers. Gaijin's reworked spawn point system has allowed players a much greater chance of coming back to rack up some more kills, but in a standard, average match, once you begin to lose the map, your team is lost, no matter how many backup vehicles you get to spawn. You're basically just throwing more steel at the enemy, hoping to maybe better your KD and earn some more RP in lines before you inevitably lose. And of course you can't just leave the match without incurring goddamn crew lock. My personal opinion is that the game needs some reworking. Now, in my recent video essay on the Challenger 1, I mentioned that the tanks should be able to range find for helicopters, which they can. That functionality was added to the game just before I made that video, which I hadn't realised, and I'm very thankful for that addition. It really does help top 2 gameplay against helicopters. What also needs to be reworked is, as I mentioned before, Radar AA tracking targets nap of the earth, but the maps also need reworking, as does the spawn system. We're going to go off on a wee bit of a tangent here. As much as you might hate getting matches on the Fulda Gap or surroundings of Volokholamsk, European Province, Maginot Line, or any of the other large-scale maps, the ironic thing is that for tier 6 tanks, the map should actually be larger than these. I know, cancer! But hold off on those comments just for a moment. We're going to add something else at the same time to make bigger maps not so cancerous. I'll say right here that these maps should absolutely be tied to 9.0 and above. No more King Tigers or T95s getting landed with these maps. Even the Chieftains would be a bloody pain to spawn in here. As far as bigger goes, I'm talking perhaps 4 or even 9 times the size of European Province. Currently, the longest sniping engagements you can really get are still only around 2.3 kilometers, which on European Province is spawn-to-spawn shooting. And that's still easily within standard combat range for tanks like the Leopard 2 or T-80B. Think about that legendary 5-kilometer world record shot from a Challenger 1. In War Thunder, the maps you fight on aren't even big enough to support that type of shot, and even if they were, tanks don't actually render in from that far away. Most engagements at top tier still happen from 1.5 kilometers away or less, and that's the main reason we don't have an armor meter anymore. It's too quick and easy for enemies to be to your flanks, and you have no side armor. And these guns are so accurate that shooting the weak spot of an Abrams or Leopard 2 from these ranges is child's play. In real-life engagements, let's take Operation Desert Storm for example, tanks are firing at each other from so far outside their optimal combat range that they're lucky to even contact an enemy tank at all, let alone hit the specific part of the tank they were aiming at. Hence, the armor matters, because incoming rounds are more than likely to actually hit it, rather than bypassing it to hit specifically the cannon breach or driver port. You go tell any real-life tank commander that in this supposedly immersive game, you kill T-80s in your M1 Abrams even at what you'd call long ranges for this game, by aiming accurately at its optics? And he'd laugh his head off at the thought. At lower tier, on maps like Abandoned Factory, one of my personal favourites, you have to drive for at least 60 seconds in a medium tank before you can even think about shooting at an enemy spawn point, and on some maps at that tier, it's even longer. The main battle tanks we have should experience the same, rather than being fired at accurately within 15 seconds of spawning. The gaps between these tanks close too quickly, and that, in my opinion, is the main problem with top tier gameplay. Challengers and Type 90s are engaging each other from no further away than a Sherman would engage a Tiger. Even from a slightly realistic standpoint, that's just a joke. These maps also need a lot more elevation differences. I mentioned earlier that Small Sinai is one of the optimal maps for helicopter gameplay. Middle East too, because they have very large terrain features like mountains right outside the tank map. The thing is, these large terrain features should be in the tank map throughout it, especially on maps verging on 12 kilometers at their widest diagonal. Imagine having forested hills like those on the outskirts of Fulda throughout the map, where you could drive your tanks up and over them through the trees along winding roads, which would be great for cover from helicopters as well. Imagine firing from one hilltop at an enemy over on another 3 kilometers away, while jets fly throughout the valleys in between. Imagine firing at tanks a full 4.5 to 5 kilometers away and it's not even spawn-to-spawn shooting. Of course, this wouldn't be the whole map. There'd be some large open plains as well, with highways running their length maybe, and some lakes or rivers or streams. Maybe some urban environments on the same map at a different section of it, maybe a Middle Eastern town or something like the castle on Fulda, but bigger, to allow for some close quarters engagements for those who want it. That sounds cool immediately in my books. A map like the Vietnam-based helicopter RB map would actually be perfect for this, or the surrounding terrain of the Japan map, so long as it's not too severe that tanks can't maneuver through it. Allow me to introduce you to my favourite tank map of the entire game, Carpathians. On this map, there are large mountains within the map, mostly unclimbable, thank God, and valleys in between. There are clearly defined sections with different elevations allowing you to see into and fire down upon different portions of the map. Upon spawning, players can choose to either go straight for the middle or drive around the mountains, flanking the map to get a vantage point on tanks in the centre. This map is annoyingly rare, even for low tier, and the only time I've ever seen it for high tier was in the 1.81 dev server, where this video clip comes from. This map would not be good for top tier tank battles, mind you.
Not in its current configuration, no sir.
It's way too small, making it once again too easy for MBTs driving at 70 km an hour to reach a vantage point over an enemy spawn, or flank around a whole team too early on in the match. But the design of the map? Oh, It's gorgeous. Perfect. 11 out of 10, Gaijin. If I could just opt to play this, Karelia, maybe Folda, and Abandoned Factory over and over again, I would. Even though I doubt a lot of you will share my love for particularly these four, but that's just personal opinion. Making a large map with the same design language that went into Carpathians or Karelia, however, or a larger, more elevated version of the Folda Gap with more elevation and unique terrain features, yes please. Of course, with maps 9 times as large as I imagine Olinus or Enix of Poland, you would get a lot of dead time in between engagements, where all you're doing is driving towards the enemy until you do close that gap down to 1.5 kilometers or less, where you can have those engagements. For this reason, I suggest this. Give us forward spawn points, perhaps only 2 kilometers away from the enemies, and then rear spawn points at the edges or corners of these massive maps, just like we have now. These forward spawn points would remain an option for respawns until the enemy tanks were within 250 meters of them, at which point they would be captured by the enemy and become an option for enemy spawns if and when there were none of your team's tanks within 250 meters of them. Basically, a cap zone that, rather than draining tickets, allows you to respawn there. We should have 2 forward spawns and 4 rear spawns on these maps, and that means that a team can achieve 8 respawn options total if they capture both of the enemy forward spawns. And while we're on the subject, these spawns should actually be something, like a forward operating base. At least set up some tents or something, with jeeps or other tanks as scenery vehicles, kind of like the T-62s and M60s on Folda. Also worth noting, the rear spawn points would not be capturable, and having 4 of them makes it much more difficult to spawn camp effectively. Now, the question I'm imagining most people having right now is, Koala, won't capturing the enemy forward spawns, forcing them to spawn miles further back, just diminish their chances of them regaining the map even further? Won't it make it practically impossible for friendlies to recapture zones before the match ends? Well, you'd be right, if these maps contained the same 1, 2, or 3 capture point system that we've had for, what, half a decade now? Boy, this video is an extensive one. We're covering spawn point systems, top tier gameplay functionality, and new game modes, as well as helicopters. Oh, I'll return to the helicopter discussion in a minute, guys. Yeah, that's right, new game modes. What I suggest is a mode with 5 capture points and a mode with 6 capture points. These would be playable only by these tiers, maybe tier 6 and above, but maybe a 4 cap point game mode would suit tier 5 and early tier 6 vehicles on large maps like Folda or European Province. Thoughts, comments, you know the drill. These capture points would be spread out, with the 5 cap game consisting of 2 caps on either side of the map behind and to the flanks of the forward spawn points, and 1 in the middle. This would allow tanks to spawn forward, turn to the back left or right side, cap their zones, gain some spawn points, and then keep that heading to go towards the flanks of the map. Or spawn forward, rely on somebody else on their team capturing those zones, and just rush for the middle to try and take the central zone and advance into enemy territory. Helicopters could even capture these points if necessary, and the large maps mean that those helicopters won't be in significant danger of coming under fire while they do. They could also infiltrate enemy territory and attempt to capture the 2 enemy zones, as the tanks are more than likely going to be progressing toward the middle of the map by this point, leaving their rears vulnerable. I'm not sure if helicopters would be able to capture the forward spawn points. Let me know your thoughts on that down in the comments below. God, there's going to be a lot of comments this video. As I suggested with the spawn zones, the capture points should also be something, like for example, a helicopter landing base, or even an airfield. I've spoken before about some of the maps of Armoured Warfare, and how I'd like to see similar in War Thunder. For all the flaws of Armoured Warfare, including the fact that it has a HP system, yuck, disgusting, the map design is gorgeous, with docks and shipyards, airfields, and other such features being incorporated into the tank battle. While we're on that subject, the idea of a progressive capture point game mode should also be considered, where more cap zones would appear as one team gets pushed further back along the map. This would be great for what I suggested before about capturable forward spawn zones, but the match could then perhaps continue extending one way or another, where they push and pull, ebb and flow, until tickets bleed out from one team having the advantage in caps for long enough. The 6 cap game mode, on the other hand, has some options. 3 caps on each side, similar to the double cap battle game mode we have now, 2 each side and 2 in the middle, 2 on each side and 1 on each flank. There are so many promising layouts for potential game modes using this formula of 6 cap points, I couldn't even hope to list them all. With much larger maps and more capture zones, the ticket drain needs to be slowed dramatically, just for these game modes mind you. That will allow for games to be long enough that the type of helicopter gameplay I mentioned earlier is feasible and lucrative, without extending matches for tankers into the realms of boredom. There'd always be something to be doing within the game. This is also why I suggested bringing back the spawning mechanics from April Fools, where only aircraft cost spawn points and ground vehicles are free and require no backups in order to spawn in infinitely. Otherwise, these massive maps are going to get real empty real fast, and that's just not great for gameplay. What could also be implemented in order to prevent this is for AIs to spawn in if and when a player leaves the match, so that there would always be an equal number of vehicles in the battle from start to finish. Of course, with an infinite ability to spawn in tanks, it would be rare for players to leave the match before it's over anyway, but I suggest using the Silver Lion cost mechanic that is present in Air Enduring Conflict in Sim, where you can keep spawning in, but you will just keep racking up repair bills, and if you see your losses start to outweigh your gains too heavily, it might be time to call it quits and just leave the match. With these new maps and new game modes, close air support also becomes more lucrative, even with Radar SPAA running rampant, and helicopters see more use without necessarily becoming more powerful or overpowered, as their usability extends to allowing them a better chance of roaming around the tank battle, but that just makes them less likely to be lobbing missiles from 6 kilometers away, and even if they are doing that, they're not any more lucrative in this role than they are right now, and they're forfeiting the ability to cap zones at the same time. In my opinion, this is how we fix helicopters. Rather than forcing them out of sniping with ATGMs without giving them a new alternative, we encourage them to assume a new role. Helicopters should also be given the scouting ability, as this would allow them to relay information to their team, but to balance things out, they should have a maximum range to scout of only 2.5 kilometers, should only be able to scout while in hover mode, and have a longer cooldown on that ability than a light tank does. Otherwise, RB will just turn into arcade, with helicopters spotting everybody in the map, meaning that no one can hide. As I stated talking about the cap zones, helicopters would have the ability to land and rearm/repair within the tank battlefield, as some of the cap zones or tank spawn zones would actually be helicopter landing pads. This just gives them another reason to be over the map, rather than sitting invincible a cancerous distance away. Let me know your own thoughts on helicopters spawning in at the beginning of battles. I personally am not sure what to think of it, so I don't want to say anything right now. It doesn't seem to fit in with the usability of helicopters, and frankly, the more lucrative way of using them is to spawn them in later in the match rather than early, but yeah, let me know what you think down below. The new designs for top tier maps would be amazing to see, as well as realistic to a certain degree, with tanks able to fire at each other from distances of 4 kilometers away or more, without that being the entire map. The gameplay would get a lot more interesting with these new 5 or 6 cap game modes, and there'd be more to do for tanks and helicopters. And with such great distances between enemies, ATGMs may see more use, which means more chemical rounds at top tier, and therefore more of an armor meta. The map design would likely take longer, which means that patches might take longer to put out, but for what I believe would be a massive improvement to top tier tank battles, I'd be more than willing to wait 3 months for new patches rather than 2. Of course, these massive maps wouldn't be every game. You'd still get the occasional Middle East, Fulda Gap, surroundings of Volokholamsk or European province, Middle East and American Desert being 2 more maps where the design language of the map is beautiful, but the map itself is just too small. But these larger maps would split up the gameplay, meaning that you don't have to deal with spawn-to-spawn shooting when you get one of these. It would likely be more immersive, and would actually be a lot better for both tanks and aircraft should Tier 6 jets come into the game sometime in the next year, which I believe they will. Anyway, that's gonna be it for this video. My god, it's been a long one. If you watched this far, I thank you so much. This video has been really fun to make actually. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, maybe share this video around. Subscribe if you haven't already so that we might hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of this year. We're getting pretty close now, but I really think we could do it. Also make sure to hit that notification bell, join the 360 squad, and come join the Koala Tree at my Discord. Follow me on Twitch, Twitter, and Instagram, all of that good stuff. Let me know your thoughts on everything I've said in this video, and as I often say when I do these massively long projects, if you want to discuss a specific point I made, do me a favour and leave the timestamp to when I said it in your comment, so that I know exactly what we're discussing. I'd love to have some conversation with you lads about the topics I've brought up here. They're pretty in-depth, and there's a lot of discussion that could be had. But let's keep it civil, alright lads? Let me know your thoughts on helicopters in general. What experiences have you had with them? I'd love to know what you think about the current meta. Maybe you think it doesn't need changing at all. Let me know. If you would like to support my channel, I'd hugely appreciate you going down into the description and checking out my Patreon. It takes time and effort for me to make these videos. This one's currently sitting at maybe 4 or 5 hours, so support from you guys really helps in that regard. There are unique new rewards for backers, including privileges on the Koala Tree, credits in videos, and even the opportunity to join Dion Albanach, my War Thunder Squadron, where you could feature in future videos on this channel yourselves. Anyway, until next time lads, always remember, keep your bagpipes to hand, keep your kilt on, and I shall see you next video. I say a wee thank you to these lads for supporting me on Patreon. Gisli Garashin and Dark Recon, you lads are bra. If you wish to join them, come check out the link in the description below.